Já.
Já, við erum komið með Mads Davidsen sem danskur og starfaði lengi í Kína hjá Shanghai SIPG og Guangzhou R&F og var hjá Brondby. Hann núna með fyrirtæki sem heitir Optima Football, að tala við knattspyrnulið hvernig að setja strategíur og það bara best að hann kynni sig sjálfur. Mads, good to have you with us.
Good to be here, thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself in the beginning? Just give us a little bit of background info on you.
Yeah, I mean, I like all other kids. I played football since I was 3 years old, I think, and always enjoyed the game, loved the game. But a mix of me not being able to play in a big club before I was quite old, the fact that I had a lot of injuries, the fact that I had maybe a lack of talent in the end, made my career very short. So I finished playing when I was 19, and then I went into coaching and basically found my way there. I didn't know, to be honest, if I had the motivation for it or the skills for it, but that kind of showed me the way, coaching from 19 years old and forward. So that was my way into football. Then at the same time, I have a master in communication from the university and also doing an MBA recently when I lived in China. So I've always tried to have like different parts of education, so it doesn't become too much only football or too much something else. I've always liked diversity.
Okay, so in Denmark you ended up at Brondby, and then you went to China with Sven-Göran Eriksson, isn't that correct?
Yeah, actually I went to China with Ebbe Sand, the former Danish striker. We opened a football academy in Shanghai. But then I got to know Sven-Göran Eriksson, and he got a job in Guangzhou R&F in the south of China, and then I joined his coaching staff down there. And then we moved on to the new club in Shanghai at that time, Shanghai SIPG. And then I was privileged to be there for 4 years and helped to build the club. So this was a great time, almost 7 years in China. So that was an incredible journey.
So obviously at Optima you are building on what you were doing at SIPG, and maybe many in Europe don't understand how big the club is, or the level of players. Can you expand a little bit about your experience there? What you came into and what you left?
Yeah, what we came into was basically nothing. I remember the first meeting when I was hired. The club secretary, he asked me, how many balls do you need? And how many cones do you need? Then I knew that this was this was from scratch. But to be honest, there was also the fascinating part that we had to, when you're working with strategies or building something longer term, often one of the biggest conflicts will be history or local culture or traditions. And in this club, there was nothing, because this was a complete new club. So the owner only had a vision. He wanted to compete for the titles in Asia, and he wanted to do it with homegrown players mostly. So that was like his two dreams. So therefore, we started to build up this club from the ground. And luckily, he also understood that we need to invest. I mean, money. Football is decided by almost 70% of the titles are won due to financial budgets, so you cannot cheat on that. Manchester City or Liverpool will win 7 out of 10 titles, for example, because they have the biggest economies. And then there is the rest of the percentages. That is the football strategies, and that's where we can make a difference for a club. So we went in trying to build a football strategy using homegrown players, not buying. And of course, adding a few top stars to the team. In China, you can only play with 3 foreigners. So these 3 has to make a quite big impact. And as I said, the owner he understood the part of he needed to invest in the team if we were supposed to be a competitor for the titles. So he invested a lot. And just to give you an idea about, you mentioned the club size, that in 2017, we had the same budget as Schalke in Germany.
Yeah.
So just to understand, the size of the club was quite big. We built a new stadium, we built a new training ground. We opened an academy where when I left in 2018, we had 11,500 players in the academy. So it's a very, very big club. But this was for me a great journey. Like you said, this is basically my, you could say, empirical work in terms of how to build a strategy, and therefore that's basically why I got the idea to make my own company afterwards, to be honest.
Yeah, just to finish with China, I think my own experience watching Chinese football was that I thought SIPG had by far the best and clearest strategy out of all the clubs. Many of the other were just, throwing leaves to the wind. So you had, fantastic coaches like Via Boas, good players, but also the whole staff and strategy seemed quite clear.
Yes, we had an owner who again understood the continuity. When we analyzed the market in China, saying how can we win in this market, we made analysis, and we could see areas or elements where we could be unique. For example, the changing of players every window. All the clubs were doing that, changing coaches all the time, and more importantly, every time they changed the coach, they also changed the style of play. They also changed new players. They changed the whole staff, because the coach would demand these kind of things. And in China, they would allow him to do it. So we basically went the other way and saying, what about that? We decide everything. We decide the style of play. We decide the methodology. We decide the players, and then we hire the coach who can fulfill this. So that's basically what we did. And when we won the Chinese Championship in 2018, we had five transfer windows without buying a player before that. And I think that's some kind of world record, actually, because normally a club for 5 windows would, if they don't buy, they would decrease in level. But we actually increased our level because of the continuity, and our players grew into the right age. We could see that when we came to the club. We had a very good group of 20 to 22-year-olds. So give them 3 or 4 years of continuity in the same style of play, and we would have the best team in China. And luckily, that was also how it went.
So you were able to develop your strategy in China in those 7 years. So how was it working as a technical director over Sven Eriksson and Villa Boas?
Yeah, so with Sven, it was different, because at that time I was on paper. I was still part of Sven's coaching team, and I was not, you could say I was functional youth technical director in the club, building up the academy in those years, but I was not technical director for Sven. So it was only when Sven left that they gave me, we got a new contract, and I got formalized the title. But in China, we did it a little bit differently. So you could say that I was more of, there was a president, there was a general manager, and there was me. And obviously I had the football knowledge in that group. So I, of course, recommended how to do this, how to build this. But in the end, they would fulfill it. So, for example, I recommended, we analyzed the coaching market. What kind of coach do we need? Who would fit to the style of play? Who would fit to the culture? Who would fit to our ambitions and working with individual players, youngsters. And therefore, we found Villa Boas. But on a more day-to-day level, I wouldn't. Villa Boas would more refer to our general manager. That was how we did it in that way. But I had a good relationship with him, and even better with Vitor Pereira, who we signed afterwards, the coach who won the championship for us. Because at that time we had already been running for some years. So as a club, we were now more clear on who we were and how we were supposed to win. So I remember the first meeting with Vito. I think he was also impressed about how clear we was, how much we could show him what we were doing. And then he could see himself go in and lift that project the last bit. So I think that's important as a club to be extremely clear to be extremely transparent for the coaches, because then they can see exactly what are the expectations, what are the limits, instead of just throwing them the keys to the club.
To finish off on China, you coached players like Wu Lei, who's now in Espanyol.
Wu Lei was a great case, of course, because in our academy strategy, even Wu Lei, of course, when we came there, he was already a senior player, 20, 21 years old. But we wanted to develop players that could play in Europe eventually also. So Wu Lei was a great example, and it was actually one of my last tasks before I left the club, to help him come to Europe. And we tried to analyze the European leagues. Where could he fit in? Which teams, which style of play would he prefer to play in? And we found Espanyol, and I think we did a good job. They have changed coaches quite a few times, which has not benefited his development, obviously. But in the end, he has played a lot of games in the league. He scored this season on Nou Camp, and has shown the world that China can also develop players. So he's a very good role model for Chinese players.
Do you think they will go to the World Cup soon, or?
I've always told them, they've not always listened to me, but I've always told them that they should aim for the 2026 World Cup. I told them that 10 years ago, because it takes around 8 years to develop a professional football player. You need around 8 years of training in an elite environment. So I told them, why do you keep chasing 2018? As long as you keep chasing 2022, you will waste time. Instead of just saying we aim completely for 2026, then that gives us 10 years back in 2016. But this is difficult, of course, in football, and also in China, where there's a lot of pressure on delivering today and not tomorrow. So I think now they are caught a little bit in between, investing too much on the A national team's chance to go to the next, instead of investing in the real interesting group of maybe 12-year-old, 14-year-old players. So, but why I mentioned the 2026 is, of course, as you probably know, the FIFA has expanded the World Cup, which will give more slots to Asia. So basically, China will have a bigger chance of going. So I think that is realistic.
So why is a strategy important for football clubs? I want to maybe share a screen and put up photo that you've been sharing on Twitter and other places.
Yep.
So you can see that now?
Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about this? Why is it important to have a strategy as a football club?
To be honest, if I'm a little bit provocative, I would say I don't see any alternative. So for me, this is completely simple, that you have to do it like this. That's how all companies are doing it in the private sectors. That's how successful organizations are built. But for some reasons, this is not how football clubs are built today. So the idea, of course, about this has a historical history. Back in the 80s and 90s, a head coach would last around 3 years in a club, averagely. Some places, some countries even more. So you could argue that the head coach was sitting long-term on the job. He was like continuity, and therefore he could actually build the club. He would bring in a style of play. He would bring his methodology, and after 2-3 years, this would be the club's style of play and methodology. So the concept worked back then in the 80s and in the 90s. Of course, we could all mention the great examples, Arsène Wenger or Sir Alex Ferguson or Guy Roux in Auxerre in France, who were there for 15, 20 years. But today, I just spoken to UEFA Intelligence Center because I'm writing a book about these matters right now. So I'm doing some research, and we are down to 16 months now for a coach to sit in a job globally. So for me to know that a person is only going to be in the club for 1 year and 4 months, it's absolutely insane to believe that we just allow him to decide start of play, the players, who we bring up for the academy, what kind of methodology we're training for. So therefore, I believe that the only chance for club to really be successful is that they own their own strategy. They build everything, as you can see in the model here, and the head coach is quite far down the line. That is basically where this model is from. You could say the current model of football clubs.
Yeah. But you are not starting to put a head coach in the style of play. You are trying to find a coach who you can adapt to the program the club has set up.
Exactly. I actually I did a discussion recently with the Danish FA also, and obviously I'm a coach from nature, so some of my colleagues were saying that you're killing us because I obviously take away some of the responsibility for our coaches, but I see it opposite. I actually think this model will make it easier to be a head coach. This model will make head coaches last longer in the clubs. They will not get sacked all the time because they will be very clear on what the expectations are, what the style of player is, what I can do, what I cannot do. We can go back to Vito Pereira. We signed for Shanghai. Now he's in his third year in the club. He's just started the third season, which is almost a record in China to have a head coach for 3 years in a row. So this is, and I think he was successful. He's a great coach, first of all, and a very good person, very professional. But he also has a very transparent description of what he is supposed to do, and I think that helps. So this is basically also to help coaches have a foundation for their work. I've been to clubs also where you come in and there is no expectations for you. There is no papers, there's no vision, there's no guiding direction. And I think it's a mess to work in an environment like that.
You said earlier that at Shanghai you had a boss, an owner who bought into the model, you know. So of course that's important. It's not enough to just educate the coaches. You have to educate the owners and the management.
Completely agree. I was very lucky with the owner there. He comes from the shipping business, and I have some network in the shipping business, and they told me that shipping leaders on that level as he is, they always think 8-10 years ahead. That's how shipping business is working. So I think I was lucky to be paired up with a guy having this long-term background of shipping. And suddenly when I told him this will take 5 years, he didn't panic as most leaders probably would. He just said that's fine with me. Just show me the progression during the period, because of course we couldn't go into 4 years of disaster and then claim that we would win the championship in the 5th year. We had to grow. We had to prove that we grew. You know, we developed KPIs, key performance indicators for the management to always follow our development, always kind of prove to them that we are on the right track. Also, if we lost two games, for example. So this is a very important way to control your management, to develop club-defined KPIs.
But when you're organizing a team who is going to take charge of, to bring young players into the first team, is it the head coach or is it the club who's in charge?
So for me, it's the club who decides how many who's going in, but again, the head coach is of course making the starting 11. But I still believe that if this is transparent from the beginning, I don't see so many conflicts, because then we are on the same page from the beginning. The difficult part is if many clubs are being taken over and the current coach has started some kind of project and suddenly the project becomes something else. I've seen that a lot in football, and that's where the conflict starts. The expectations trigger each other. But for example, I was working as a consultant for Brondby last year, and this was a transition period where we were hiring a new head coach. So I joined that process to find a new head coach, and we analyzed the market. And of course, in the conversations with the current head coach, the club was very clear on what kind of project it is, what kind of power you have and don't have, what we aim to be. And I think that's why we see now in in December 2018, Brondby played with 11 foreigners in a game against Hobro, which it was a disaster for the club's history, traditions, brand, DNA, to be playing with 11 foreigners in the game in the Danish Super League. So that was basically what we wanted to move away from. And one of the last games now here, almost 1.5 years later, before this virus, Brondby had, I think, 7 Danes in the lineup and 4 academy players in the lineup. So for me, it's not rocket science. It's just been cleared out from the beginning what the new head coach was supposed to do, what kind of project this is, where I think the former head coach had too much power. He could do what he wants, and the club couldn't stop it because nothing was agreed beforehand.
It seems like in Denmark, the clubs like Nordsjælland and Midtjylland, who have, quite a clear strategy compared to most clubs, they also are able to sustain their, success quite well in relative terms.
Yeah, of course. Though both clubs are doing well. Midtjylland is more on a recruitment level. I would say that's been their strategy, to be strong on recruitment, buying and selling. Where Nordsjælland is training, is developing. And then, of course, they have that advantage of having 2 academies, one in Ghana and one in Nordsjælland. And suddenly, after 3-4 years of training, the same methodology, suddenly you develop top players both places, and you can combine them, and suddenly you have a very, very interesting project. So I think they're very clear on the strategy. Again, there's no hidden agendas. There's no club owner who panics after 3 losses in a row. Everyone knows the direction, and then it's just to move on.
So what you're saying obviously also goes for football associations, the national associations. It's obviously better if they have a clear strategy as well.
Yeah, you could argue that associations, it's a little bit different size, because normally a season for a national team is 8 games, which is a very low amount of games, which means that you cannot spend 20 games developing a style of play and then expecting to win the last 5. Then you're already not qualified for the World Cup. Compared to a league system where there's much more games, much more trainings to develop. But I think in general, an FA should have an identity. They should combine the local culture, the national culture, with a style of play that fits the expression. I think without knowing it completely, that's a little bit what happened in Denmark recent years. We had the Norwegian head coach Åge Hareide, who on paper has done a good job result-wise, but still we don't feel the excitement in the population. There's not sold out for the games, because what he has done is not very Danish culture to win more pragmatic and a little bit more defensive, a little bit more trying to avoid before he tried to achieve, where Danes are born with 1986 national team who tried to achieve, and they almost fascinated the whole world in Mexico and all that story. So I think it's very important that you understand the culture where you're working. And the same in China, where if you think you get 10 games to just practice your style of play, then you are already gone. I was also coaching a U23 team, which you should argue is a development team, not a results team. And when we didn't win the second game in the league, I was already called in for a meeting for the management group. So this is part of the pressure you have to handle. But of course, everyone should have a style of play. Everyone should have a idea about a association national methodology, because otherwise we are just training. Now you could argue also in China, some of the issues is that maybe you have a French coach for the under-17 team, you have a Spanish coach for the under-19 team, you have a Chinese coach maybe for the under-21 team. There's no alignment in the style of play. There's no alignment in the way they work. There's no crossover philosophy at all, which means that it's completely confusing for the players to go from one national team to the other. The transition is simply too long. So I would always argue that you have to ask yourself. I've also said this on a Danish FA conference, because I think this is some of the things even the Danish FA has not solved yet. That what characterize a Danish player, for example, what characterize a Danish coach. I cannot answer those questions, and that's actually a problem, because if you ask what characterizes a Spanish coach, we would actually have an idea. We would start saying some words that we think is Spanish style or is devoted to Spanish football. But in Denmark, I cannot answer the question, for example. That's an issue.
I was wondering about your Brondby work, and when you were restructuring the club, what was the first thing you did at the club in this job, and when you're looking for young players to develop the team, how deep down in the youth system did you look for players?
So the first thing I did was for this specific task was to make an analysis about the whole club, basically, because I had to go in and find out what is the status, what is the issues, and how can we solve them, because the owner and the board was obviously seeing that 5 years of investment hasn't really helped. The club is at the same stage. Now the problem was suddenly we have an old squad. We couldn't sell players. Academy players were not coming through anymore. So there was no club identity anymore. There was no alignment through the club. So I went in and just observed a lot, to be honest. That's part of my consultancy, to go in and observe and report what is the status. And then the next phase is, of course, the preparation. How can we develop this? So we changed the first team head coach. We sold out some older players. We made a new recruitment strategy, never to buy over 24 years old players. Then we started to look at the academy. We brought in, I think, 5 or 6 players from the under-19 team into the first team squad. We looked at the groups, 17, 19. They lacked a little bit of quality, so we went out and bought 2 young players from other clubs. One of them is actually playing now in the starting 11 of Brondby, just to lift the top level of the groups. And then we looked and we saw under 15, 14, 13, we have some of the best players in Denmark. So suddenly it's only a matter of time before the model will be reunited. But then you need, of course, to make sure that time is also, we're also getting some kind of results, and the club want to go into top 3 every year. So have to find a mix between building a team and playing with youth that can be top 3 in a Danish Super League standard. And then after that, we went even lower. We went down to under 8. And because at Brondby, the facilities are quite unique. You have from the first team to under 6 training on the same training pitches. So this is quite unique. You have everything gathered. It's 2 different companies. You have the professional company down to under 12, and then under 11 and down is with the amateur club federation. But we want, of course, to build the same mindset, the same philosophy. So I think right now the club is, I wouldn't say it's a strong foundation, but it's definitely a foundation they can be strong in the future if they continue this work.
Yeah, I saw they were playing over the last few games with 3 or 4 youth team players in the first team. So it's a quite change of the team over here.
Yes, and suddenly you see speaking of always combining the club strategy to the local culture or the tradition of the club, suddenly you see the effect in the fan base are much more positive. The sponsors are much more positive. I remember one of the first days I arrived there, I went to the training pitch in the afternoon to watch the academy's team's training, and I had parents, agents coming to me and complaining immediately. We will leave, we will take our boy another place if this is not solved. And I saw so many problems. I had youth coaches who told me I don't know what to do. I'm not being told what to do. So there was many issues. But I think we slowly turned the ship. And now I'm not involved there anymore. It was just a 9-month consultancy. But I think the club is starting to look like the old Brondby.
So you came to Iceland last year, just on a brief visit. Did you have any thoughts about our environment when you were here? Because
Yeah,
I know you
definitely.
visited a couple of clubs, including Hákon.
Yeah, no, it was very interesting. It was a private. My wife was supposed to run the Reykjavik Marathon. She's an athlete as well. So I went there. We have some friends from Shanghai who's Icelandic, and they live in Reykjavik now. So this was a good chance of combining different things. And then when I go on holiday, I always try to make something football-related meetings or watch a game or training. So I went to watch 2 games in the league, and I visited 2 clubs. And of course, had a few meetings also with the Icelandic FA as well, just to share ideas and see how you're working. And I found it interesting. I think Iceland has unfolded potential in some way. I mean, you actually have much better facilities than I expected, to be honest, in terms of the domes and in general. Football-related facilities, and also you have the advantage of being small, and you have to use that positively, because in Denmark sometimes we always complain, oh, we cannot compete against Germany because we're only 5 million people and they are 80, which of course is true, but being small also make you agile. You can do things smoother and faster. It's the same problem in China when I was working there, because they're so huge. So I had an academy, for example, in Inner Mongolia. One of our academy settings was in Inner Mongolia, and for me that's a trip for 6 hours flight if I want to go there to see the academy training. So it's very difficult to control. Where in Iceland, I think the clubs are so close to each other. Is it 77 clubs there is or something like that in Iceland? That if I was the FA, if I was the club federation, if you could make one Icelandic identity, you know, I would put everything together, make everyone work on the same direction, make everyone understand the importance for the country's sake. Use that advantage of being so small that you can actually have everyone working in the same direction. You can go to the same meetings. You can take the same inspiration evenings, because everyone can join in. Where in China, this is impossible. I could gather the coaches twice a year from all our academies around China. That was the only chance I had to develop them. So this was the 2 parts I noticed the potential in terms of. Also, you have a good sporting culture. You can see many kids wants to do sports also through the school system, and of course you have good history also in for example handball as well. So you have kind of an elite mindset in your country. So those things combined, that you have elite mindset, you have sports culture, you have facilities, and you're small, so you can be agile. I mean, you can really make a good strategy with these elements.
It's quite good to hear. So if you look 5 or 10 years ahead, I know you have done some research on that. What are the demands of the game and in that time, and how can we plan and work towards it?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of analysis on this, and also had some meetings. I was just before the coronavirus. I stayed 5 days in Benfica with their technical director and their club setup. I've spent a few days with Paris Saint-Germain and their performance department, who's also doing these kind of analysis about football and football towards 2025 or whatever we would call it. And I think we see some interesting patterns. The game is getting faster, which means that we don't have to run faster. This is sometimes the misunderstanding, but we need to think faster. And we need to make decisions faster. And football is a decision-making sport, but we need to make decisions based on something. I still see too much coaching today where the players are set free. The players is more or less can, within a very simple frame, do what they want especially on the offensive part, where if you analyze the top 5 leagues in Europe and the Champions League over the last 3-4 years, which is what I've been doing, you can see that the offensive patterns are much more structured than they were 5 years ago. So much more goals are scored after combinations now in the last third. More goals are scored after more passes in the final third. So you have more control close to the goal. You don't try to score all the time. You wait for the right moment. The best teams in the world, they have actually less shots on goals, but score more goals. So what do that tell us? That tells us that they're actually not better at finishing, but they play the chances bigger before they finish. They use structure and patterns before they find the danger zone, and they will try to score. Where 5 years ago you would be happy if a player he would shoot from 30 meters, whereas today we know that basically he will never score. So these kind of structural things has made the game a more of a thinking game, and which means we have to develop cognitive, stronger players who can think and act faster, but always in a contextual team effort, not just because the problem is I've seen some games with teams who are not very structured, that if you and me play together and I have the ball and I don't know where you're going, basically, then I have to look and wait for you to move, which will delay my decision. And the same, if you don't know where I'm going to play the ball, you have to look at me and wait for my signal. Whereas if this is put into a pattern, we can do it faster because I know in this situation maybe you will move to the left, and I can even play the ball before you arrive in that zone. So these kind of things we have to teach the players so they can play faster. And that's also what Paris Saint-Germain was very focused on, to develop decision making more faster by making a better structure. You mentioned FC Nordsjælland before. If you've watched some of their games, you can see that they can play sometimes in the last third. They can have 3 or 4 passes in their breakthrough on first touch. And how you can play the ball 3-4 times on first touch is only possible if you know what your teammates are doing, where they're going to be. Otherwise, you have to stop the ball and look, and that will delay your decision, and then we will not be able to compete on the highest level. Another little factor is the amount of tackles in football is going down dramatically, whereas the amount of interceptions is going up. So again, as coach, what does that tell us? That tells us that this is becoming an active game instead of reacting game. Again, the tempo is going up. We have to read the pass. We have to put pressing traps down to intercept the ball. We cannot wait until we can tackle the person. So again, this have to reflect on how we train kids down to 12 years old, that they have to learn to read the game, intercept the game, instead of making a good old-fashioned tackle, because this is simply not being done on top level. One of my former players I worked with in Brondby 10 years ago, Andreas Christensen, who now plays for Chelsea, is very interesting to follow. He played when Chelsea won the championship a couple of years ago under Antonio Conte. Andreas was playing almost every game as a central defender. He didn't get 1 yellow card in 37 Premier League games, and he made under 1 tackle per game. Now, if you hear those numbers, you might think that he was a bad defender for Chelsea, but the point is that he is probably one of the players I have seen who is best at reading the game. So he won the interception list of defenders that season. So this is, for me, he's a good example of the modern central defender, for example. So this is just to give you a few insights from the analysis and the report we did on what direction football is moving into.
Obviously, both of these things come from coaches looking at data. For example, this thing with more goals from fewer shots. You know, players are making better decisions and not just kicking the ball from 30 yards every time they have an opening, because it's a low probability shot. So they're looking for high probability shots and being more smart about the defending. So as the data revolution, encompasses football, what should we have in mind? What is important to have in mind when we start working with data?
Yeah, but I think like you just said, it's important to understand that, of course, data cannot stand alone. I hear some people talk about data-driven clubs, but for me, that's never going to happen. It's going to be data-supported clubs, because data will not take decisions for us, but they can guide us. Like you just said, the examples I just used is obviously data proving some trends and tendencies in football. I just saw last week it came from the German Football Association, DFB, with a new analysis on goal kicks after the rules of the defenders being able to stand inside the penalty area zone, where you can see that all the top 5 leagues has much more short goal kicks now, because obviously they now see attacking advantage, that they can play the ball faster to each other. They can play away more from the first pressing zone. They can make more pressing traps, and suddenly they can control the game from early on. So this is, for me, again, data we have to use, especially for us, Denmark and Iceland. We are small countries. We will never be trendsetters. We will not. But we have to try to follow the trend, because for me, our goal should always be to develop players who can play on the highest level. Yes, when you're in a club, you also want to win on Sunday, but your biggest aim should always be, can we develop a player who can play in the Premier League or in La Liga or whatever the top 5 is. So for me, data is supposed to be used like that. Scouting, of course, another area where data cannot tell you who to buy, but they can guide you in a direction. We had an interesting case in Shanghai SIPG where we were close to buying Sylvester Igbun, who played for FC Midtjylland, the Nigerian winger, back in 2016. And just before the window closed, the deal collapsed. And to be honest, we were not that prepared on a plan B, because we were so close of signing this player. But then we had developed an algorithm. We had some data scientist for the club hired, and basically we just asked him to put in the skills of Igbun and basically press enter to see what would pop up. And on the top list, there came a player called Sean Everquasi. So I went to Hajduk Split, where he played, a young boy from Ivory Coast. And to be honest, if you watch those 2 players together, they are almost like twins, Igbun and Kwasi. So we ended up buying Kwasi, and it was a great signing for us. He became very successful, and even the club ended up selling him on and earning money on him. But it was just to say that he was actually found through data, through work with a technical algorithm. I never heard about the player before. So this is the way you can use data. You can find some things that you wouldn't have found. But that doesn't mean the subjective part will not disappear. I still had to go to Split to see him play. I still had to do my check about his background, about his personality, all these kind of classic recruitment scouting things. But data can definitely help us to guide us.
Yeah. Hákon, þú ert á mute.
Finally, Mads, we have some crisis in the world at the moment, the virus and everything. How do you see the football in Europe and probably Denmark coming out of this crisis? Some clubs are having problems, and we might see some foreign players cheaper coming in, or are clubs going to stay for the youth players? How do you see it coming?
Very interesting question, and I can on one side I can hope the best, and on the other side I fear the worst, in terms of I've already seen a few Danish owners or board members who said in the media, Danish media, for example, that now they might buy a level better foreign players because they will be cheaper. And obviously they have to do that. That's their club and their decision. But I'm a little bit afraid that it will be too easy to grab more foreigners and bring into the club, which would again lower the chance of homegrown players to be playing. And again, when we are development countries like Iceland and Denmark, in terms of we are small, we will never be the biggest leagues, we will never be the richest. I still think our main focus should be on developing players. And the Danish league just came out with a survey last week about the amount of homegrown players has been falling constantly over the last 4 or 5 years. We're down to 18% of the playing time is given to homegrown players in the Danish Super League, which for me is way too low. They should be the double. We should be around 40% in a league like the Danish league, because it's not one of the best leagues in the world. So we should simply have the guts to play more youngsters. And I heard a little bit the same when I went to Iceland, actually. And I remember when I spoke to some people there and also a few agents up there, they were saying a little bit the same, that there seems to be not the coaches or the clubs not being brave enough to actually go full in and play youngsters. I don't know if that's completely true, but I heard that also about Iceland.
Probably the same problems everywhere.
So that's a global effect. Yeah. But again, if I was hired as a consultant for Manchester City, of course, I would not go in and recommend to play 7 academy players, because this is a different project. They are there to win. They are global leader, and to be a youngster there to develop a youngster for that is almost impossible. I've been visiting City many times, and I remember the same guy who has been there for now 10 years. And he said to me last time I was there, he said in 2008, his job was to develop a Premier League player. And he said, that is, to be honest, very difficult. And then I met him last year, and he said, now my job is to develop a Champions League winner. That is impossible. So it's just to say that when you work on that level, then of course the strategy is different, and that will affect your academy. But when we are Denmark, or we are Iceland, or we are China, it doesn't matter. We should have more guts to play the youngsters and believe in these long-term projects, not only for ourselves but also for the country. Okay,
Mads, thank you very much for taking the time. It was very informative, and hope we can see you in Iceland again.
Hopefully, yes.
And enjoy the sun in Spain.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Mads.
Thank you.